My name is John Klaassen. I'm Associate Professor of Global Studies here at Boyce College, and I want to tell you how excited I am to be able to share with you a little bit about what we do in our program and about how we teach and the things that we teach. Being a professor of global studies means that I have some ideas about what it takes to live overseas and serve overseas. My wife and I served for almost 18 years. For 18 years overseas in North Africa in varying cultures. We had to learn 2 different languages besides English and learn how to adjust to different aspects of the world that we were living in. And so today I want to talk to you a little bit about what that means and how do you live in another world that is so different from your world, right? So as we think about that, we think about, well, what is culture? And I love to think about culture. I like to think about what it takes to live in another culture. And the truth is I love to live in other cultures. If you choose to come to Boyce College, or you will find that you have moved yourself into a new culture. Boyce has a culture, just as the place that you are from has a culture. Everyone has culture. Culture's universal. It's something that is given to us by God. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. I think the fruitful talks about how we are to rejoice and enjoy the life that God has given to us. But the multiply is very clear. We are to have children, and our children are to have children, and their children are to have children. And pretty soon we have society, and within society we will have culture, because that's how we relate to each other. Paul Hebert defines culture as a partially integrated system of ideas, feelings, and values encoded in learned patterns of behavior, signs, products, rituals, beliefs, and worldviews shared by a community of people. What he tells us is that culture is, in fact, a people's way of life. It's how you do what you do every single day. It's how you see and understand the world. It's how you interact with people. It's how you know what to do when you're on the street and you run into somebody that you know, or what you do when you're in church and what you do when you meet them in church. You know, do you give them a big hug? Do you give them a hand? And right now during this whole COVID crisis, you tap each other's foot, or you give each other an elbow or a fake high five, or the gun or the salute, or whatever it is that you do. Culture determines how it is that we greet one another and how it is that we interact together. It's a way of it's a people's way of life. It's our way of coping with our biological, physical, and social environment. So one of the things that I always ask my students, because we'll have students that come from the South and we'll have students that come from the North, and you guys are probably from somewhere in there. You're maybe from the Midwest, or you're Southern, or you're from the East Coast, or you're from the West Coast. And, how is it that you talk to one another? How do you cope with your environment? So one of the things that we know from Southerners as a generalization of them in culture is that they kind of speak with a drawl, right? They kind of draw things out as they speak, and it's a little bit slower, and we get a lot of y'alls in there. I remember we had a medical doctor on our team from Argentina when we were serving overseas, and she went to Lebanon during an event and that had happened there during the war, and she was working with some North Carolinian doctors. And she said when she came back after spending about a month with these North Carolinian doctors, she came back and she said, "John, I learned a new word this week or this month." And I said, "Well, Mariela, tell me your word." And she said, "Okay, you ready for it?" And I said, "I'm ready." And she said, "Jeet yet?" And I said, "Mariela, that's not a word. I don't know what you just said." And she said, "Yes, you do. Jeet yet?" And I said, "No, Mariela, that's not an English word. That's nowhere in the dictionary. I don't know what that word is." And she said, "Yes, just listen closely. Did jeet yet? Did you eat yet? Jeet yet?" Right? So, that Southern drawl, right? Where we put it all together and we kind of we spread it out. But if you're from the North, you're not going to say jeet yet. You're going to say, "Did you eat yet?" It's going to be much clearer, much more succinct, much more defined, right? What's interesting about that is when you travel the world, you find that worldwide. I learned Spanish in southern Spain, and southern Spain has a very definite draw to it. And when I'm in southern Spain and I speak in southern Spain, everybody says, "Yeah, I know where you're from." But when I go up north, it's much crisper, it's much clearer, it's much cleaner. It's just like in the United States, Northern English is much crisper, whereas in the South, it's more like G yet, right? It's more of a drawn out, brought together form of speaking. Well, why is that? Well, we understand that in the North, it's a lot colder and it's crisper, right? And you're not going to spend so much time drawing things out. You want to get directly to the point. And whereas in the South, you're going to just draw things out because you got time and you're relaxed and it's warm and it's friendly and it's just different. Relationships are different, right? Who has more friends, Southerners or Northerners, right? Are Northerners considered cold? Are Southerners considered warm? Well, this is that hot, cold climate thing. It's not that Northerners are cold as people. They're very warm as people, but they don't spend a lot of time out on the street. They don't have a million friends. They just have a few friends, whereas a Southerner will have a whole lot of friends and maybe not go as deep with those friends as a Northerner does because they spend more time with specific people. These are all just cultural aspects. It's not good or bad. It's not right or wrong. It's just a cultural aspect of life. And we have to learn that. We have to understand that. It's like the Northerner who goes to New York and is saying y'all to everybody and speaking with that accent, that Southern accent. Northerners are rejecting of that, or that Northerner who comes to Alabama and speaks with that very crisp, very clear, very direct way, and it creates conflict, right? So we understand that it's a way of coping, and it's a way of coping with our biological and our physical social environment. This is what we do. This is how we act. This is how we respond. It also consists of learned patterned assumptions, concepts, and behavior, right? So what is it that you do? And we learn these things, right? And we make assumptions based off of them, and they are behavioral, right? So again, and I hate to pick on North and South so much, but I'm from the Midwest. And in the Midwest, I was taught that when someone addressed you, you said yes or you said no. But in the South, you always say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And you say that all the time. But where I was brought up in the Midwest, the only people that I said yes, sir, and no, sir, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am to were the police, to someone in very direct authority over me, or my football coach, And boy, if I didn't say yes, sir, to my coach, I was in all kinds of trouble. But I didn't have to do that with anyone else. But when I started working with people from the South, I quickly realized how important that sir and ma'am is, and how important it is that we say those things, right? Whereas where I had grown up, it wasn't as important. So as I took my kids and raised my kids, I had to teach them to adjust to these different cultures and different ways of being. So it's learned patterned assumptions, concepts, and behavior. My kids grew up in Latin America, or not in Latin America, but in Spain and North Africa. And in Spain and North Africa, there's a different concept of space, right? So in America, especially now, social distancing isn't quite as hard for Americans because we don't mind space, right? But in places where they have tighter space, where they just in between people, they're really struggling with this concept of social distancing. When I would go to church in Spain, I was required, just because of culture, to kiss all of the ladies on the right cheek and then on the left cheek. And if I hadn't seen a man in quite a while, I was required to kiss him on the right and the left cheek. My wife was required to kiss all of the men and required to kiss all of the women whenever we went to church. And this was just the way that you do it. And to not do it meant that you were rude. It meant that you were ugly. It meant that you were just distant from everyone, right? Now, obviously, we don't do that in America. So whenever we'd bring my boys home from overseas, and it was really not so different in Morocco as well, whenever we would come back, I'd have to sit down with them and I'd have to say, now listen, when you guys are with other boys, when you're with other guys, you need to make sure that you understand that there needs to be some social distance, right? There needs to be some separation between you. And if you don't do that, kids are going to make fun of you. And so we had to teach them a new way of being. The funny part about that is the other MKs that they grew up with, they're very, very close. And so they're accustomed to that real tight space. And even today, so my kids are are adult men now, and they're married, and their friends are married that they grew up with. But whenever they get together, they'll sit on a sofa of 4 people, and they'll put 8 of them in that sofa, and they're just hugging on each other, and they're sitting on each other, and they're just enjoying one another's space, right? Because that's their culture. That's what they're accustomed to. Whereas in the United States, we would never do that. We separate ourselves and we create that social distance. Now with COVID, we're separating ourselves even more, but we're accustomed to that, right? And we assume that that's the case. So we have these learned patterned assumptions, concepts, and behavior, the way that we act, the way that we respond, the things that we do. How do I know whose hand to hold? In some parts of the world, a guy holds a guy's hand, but he doesn't hold a girl's hand. So where we lived in North Africa, as a man, I would hold another man's hand, but I would never hold a woman's hand, right? And even in society, we were taught that my wife was supposed to walk 3 steps behind me. Now, this is where culture gets really interesting, because we also need to look at culture and we need to ask the question, well, where do I want to be countercultural, right, in order to demonstrate something new and different? So one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate was that I loved my wife. So whenever we were together, I would hold her hand in public, because I wanted people to see that not only was she my wife, but she was my friend. And that I cared deeply for her, and that I love her very much. And, people would look at us and it seemed a little strange to them, but they would get the idea. Another thing that was very clear in our culture is that men could not take care of their children. It was always really interesting and kind of funny to watch when I would do things that were a little bit different. And so one of the things that I would do is to allow my wife to go deep with other women, I would keep the kids at home. And then she would go and she'd make her visits to her friends, and she could go deep in the gospel that way, or in discipleship or something along those lines. But whenever she would get to their house, the women would say, well, where are the boys? We only had 2 sons. And my wife would say, well, John's taking care of them. And these women at the beginning, they would get this panicked look on their face. And they would say, well, can he take care of them? Will they be okay? And she'd say, no, John takes care of them all the time. He's a great dad. He loves to be with his kids. And they'd say, no, that's not right. That's not normal. Well, they'd get used to it. And then their husbands would come to me later and they'd say, John, I'm really kind of mad at you. I say, well, what did I do wrong? And they say, well, you're taking care of your kids. Now I have to take care of my kids. So stop it, right? But it was a great way of demonstrating, hey, this is family. This is who we are. And this is what the gospel does inside our family. So we think about how we want to be cultural, and we think about how we want to be countercultural, right? Within the norms and the patterns and the assumptions and the concepts of the behavior that we're given. If you become a part of the Global Studies program, one of the things that we'll do is we'll spend a lot of time talking about, well, how do we make the gospel, how do we help the gospel be understood within the new culture that we're going to? How do we work within that culture? How do we share within that culture? How do we learn? How do we know that culture so that the gospel become relevant within that culture, so that they can truly understand the grace of God and the work of God in their lives? I hope this week, as you're thinking through your college choices and as you're thinking about coming to school here, that you'll think about our Global Studies program, that you'll think about the things that you can learn to better equip you to work in new and different places, that'll better equip you to think about the nations, to think about a world that's lost and in desperate need of true gospel conversations, and how we might do that in proper ways. Know of my prayers for you. I'm sorry that we're not doing this live. I'm sorry that we can't be together right now. But in a world of chaos, I want you to know that there is understanding in the gospel, and there is beauty in the gospel as we are brothers and sisters together. And I hope that you'll think about coming and studying here at Boyce College and being a part of our programs. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.